Welcome to the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. I'm KM Weiland, and I am here to take you deep with story theory, writing techniques, and the incredible wisdom of story. I believe story is the greatest power on this earth, and that as writers, we carry the torch of wielding that power with responsibility, passion, and skill. There is no such thing as just a story. Today, it is my honor and my purpose to help you write your best story, astound the world, and maybe change your life. Hello and welcome. You are listening to Season 17, Episode 7. Today's episode is sponsored by Demonza.com. As one of the leading names in book cover design right now, they have designed most of my book covers, and they are currently offering free book cover reviews. So whether you're about to publish or you're just curious to know how your cover stacks up, this review is a no-brainer. This will give you a fresh, informed perspective that offers crucial insight into how your book cover performs in today's competitive market. So don't miss this chance to make your book unforgettable. It's totally free, and all you have to do is visit demonza.com/review/WBA to get started. That's demonza.com/review/WBA. And now, welcome to this week's episode. How to make your fantasy world feel real. 6 pillars of organic world building. Nothing pulls readers into an epic story quite like a fantasy world that feels real, a place so immersive it seems to extend beyond the page. The best fantasy worlds feel like they existed long before the story began, with deep histories, dynamic cultures, and internal logic that makes every detail feel inevitable. So, how can you make your fantasy world feel real? As one of the hottest genres on the market right now, fantasy seems to be everywhere. So many writers are interested in introducing fantastical elements into their stories. But even though it can seem as if fantasy authors can simply do whatever they want in their stories, since bending reality is the point, this isn't actually the case. Exactly because of its potential for sprawling possibilities, successful fantasy requires a sure hand at the helm. And this is nowhere truer than when it comes to world building. So I decided to share this episode in response to a request from Timothy Joseph Coakley, who asked, "I would like you to write about fantasy world building." In fantasy, world building isn't just about settings. Fantasy worlds play a much larger role than simply a physical background. For starters, a good fantasy world provides the necessary verisimilitude to help audiences suspend disbelief and invest their interest and sympathy in stories set in far-flung landscapes. More than that, as perhaps the most symbolic of all genres, fantasy does best with world building that upholds a deeper level of meaning and metaphor. And this can be done through parallels and references to real-life historical contexts, as well as by developing the quote-unquote natural laws that govern the story's magic system. And we'll talk about this more in a bit. Fantasy also requires a great deal of originality in its settings. Although Singapore or San Francisco can be used over and over in realistic fiction, fantasy requires a fully original setting for every new story. Although motifs emerge, usually via historical periods, such as the Middle Ages, or popular aesthetic trends, such as steampunk, every fantasy world requires its own original social, historical, and sometimes even physical, as in the law of physics, context. And that's no small task. But crafting all these details is also one of the chief joys of fantasy and one of the main draws for many authors. However, by its very importance, authors also can't afford to overvalue their fantasy world building. The world, including its magic system, creatures, history, language, landscape, and more, must exist to serve the story. In fantasy, perhaps more than any other genre, the world building becomes a key part of the plotting process, just as the plotting process becomes key in informing the world building. Similar to weaving together a story's plot, character arc, and theme, Fantasy authors must employ what I call the bob and weave. And this is a flexible method that recognizes the integral symbiosis of all story parts. So instead of plotting or world building in a strict linear fashion, this technique encourages you to move back and forth between elements and returning to adjust earlier sections as new ideas take shape. The goal isn't to lock yourself into a strict blueprint, but to build a framework that evolves naturally as your understanding of the story deepens. Although in some ways historical fiction has always been my true love, most of my stories have landed in the fantasy genre, and world building has always been one of my favorite parts of the process, not least because integrating the setting into the plot allows it to become a vibrant and thematically pertinent character in its own right. Now, my absolute number one resource for fantasy world building has always been and remains Patricia C. Reed's bravura list of fantasy world building questions, which you can find by just Googling that. It's that well known. And it organizes its hundreds of pertinent prompts into every useful category you could ever think of. So if you have no idea what to do with your fantasy world, start there. And if you're already deep into building your world, circle back around at the end and you can use her questions to make sure you haven't missed anything. Now, today we're going to talk about a more organic approach to your fantasy world building, starting with the following 6 pillars. And this will show you how to make your fantasy world feel real. Tip number 1, start with the symbolism and the theme and character arc. Your choices for your fantasy world should never be arbitrary. Every piece of the setting should be intentionally chosen to support what's most important, the story arc. Ideally, the fantasy world and its magical, that is non-realistic aspects, will act as an extension of your thematic metaphor by creating external events that create and resolve your character's inner journey. Now, this doesn't mean your setting's symbolism should be obvious. At its simplest, the setting should function to create the story's conflict, which will, in turn, evolve the protagonist's arc, which will, in turn, reveal and prove the story's theme. This means that if you have a really cool idea for a setting, but it doesn't directly interact with your character's personal crises, it probably isn't an integrated choice. So think about Star Wars. Its setting of a galaxy far, far away felt particularly appropriate in a story about an intergalactic war featuring a protagonist whose personal journey was integrally connected to that galaxy's tyrannical rulers. You can look to your theme for initial ideas about how to create or strengthen your setting. If you're uncertain, turn to your understanding of historical, mythological, or archetypal stories. Is there a motif that feels catalytic to your plot or character ideas? For example, the erupting classism of the Victoria period provided a potent backdrop for the fantasy carnival row, which played out themes of racism by exploring the relationships of different fantasy creatures, Picts or fairies, Pucks or fauns, and Merocs or werewolves, etc. Tip number 2, explore magic and/or religion. Perhaps the single factor that sets true fantasy apart from alternate history is its inclusion of fantastical elements, most often in the form of magic. Now, how this magical element alters the rules of nature as we know them opens up all sorts of interesting possibilities. Because fantasy magic represents unfamiliar forces, it automatically becomes a type of metaphor as audiences seek a real-life parallel through which to understand this story element. And most commonly, magic represents power, creating the opportunity for thematic explorations of power's cause and effect, both for good and evil. For example, Lord of the Rings' primary example of magic is simply the existence of the demonic One Ring, through which are explored questions of the corrupting influence of power and the countering possibilities of devotion and grace. Throughout the decades of fantasy world building, magic systems have become notoriously more complex and sophisticated. Magic maestro Brandon Sanderson sets the bar for thematically cohesive magic systems based on cohesive and logical laws of use, usually created by organizing the system around a unifying catalyst, such as metals in Mistborn. However, it bears saying once again that the story doesn't serve the magic system. The magic system serves the story. So although complexity can be fun, complicated is not. Cohesion and a tidiness of focus are hallmarks of magic systems that enhance their stories rather than taking away from them. Audiences, not to mention you, should be able to explain how your magic system works in a few sentences. You can layer complexity on top of that, but the basics should be clear. For example, Rebecca Yaros's staggeringly popular Fourth Wing and its sequels offers a complex magic system full of revelations and twists, but the basis of its magic system is clear enough to describe in one sentence. Dragons bond with riders and give them unique powers. One of the best ways to integrate your magic system into your world is to look at how it appears from within your world. Magic systems will often be established within a story world as either scientific, for example, Fourth Wing, or spiritual/religious, for example, Lord of the Rings or Bloodsong, or a little of both, for example, Mistborn, Black Prism, Star Wars. Even if you don't feel your magic system naturally arises from one of these angles, examine how both institutions interact with the magic. Plenty of metaphors waiting to happen right there. And for a handy guide to creating a cohesive and complete magic system, check out C.R. Rowinson's Magic System Blueprint. Tip number 3, connecting the antagonist and the climax. One of the most important parts of making your fantasy world feel real is integrating it cohesively with your plot. And one of the best ways to do that, whether you're creating, double-checking, or troubleshooting, is to consider your story's finale. Remember, your story's ending proves what it's about. So whatever happens in your climax, however it decides the conflict, that is your story. Everything leads up to that. Although fantasy can focus on smaller, more relational stories, the genre is best known for epic confrontations between forces of good and evil. A good battle is de rigueur for a fantasy climax. As such, fantasy is also usually known for its strong antagonist characters. Like all parts of the story, the antagonist should never be an arbitrary decision. Apart from the usual requirements that the antagonist be formed as a worthy foil to challenge the protagonist on both the outer and inner levels, a fantasy antagonist should also be chosen to fully represent the opposing aspects of the thematic premise. In fantasy, as we've already discussed, it's even more important than usual for the theme to be sewn into every part of the world building. And this means crafting the antagonist is fundamentally a world-building decision, even more so in some ways than crafting the protagonist. Think of it this way. If your story's magic symbolizes the theme in some way, then the antagonist must interact with that magic in a way that opposes or challenges the protagonist's own use of it. For example, almost all of the great fantasy stories offer obvious examples of thematic antagonists, including Star Wars and Lord of the Rings. But one of the best examples is Harry Potter, in which the protagonist's evolution into his full magical ability is continually contrasted by, compared to, and challenged by the antagonist's relationship to that same magic. And this story is a particularly good example of tight plotting thanks to an antagonist who, even in his absence, is never an arbitrary opponent or simplistic representation of evil, but rather is a mirror to the protagonist's own character arc as he explores the potential of magic as a metaphor for both corrupted power and love. Tip number 4, shaping history, culture, and government. The fun of fantasy is that it allows us to explore scenarios that look like things we are familiar with, but without needing to worry about getting all the facts right. The flip side is this means you have to make up everything, and you have to do it in a way that feels just as real as real life. In some ways, it's actually more work than research. It is tons of fun, though. As long as you're focusing on several key areas, you can easily create a facsimile world that feels utterly real and convincing. Start with your world's history, culture, and government. These three will be intertwined. More bob and weave, anyone? And it should go without saying, they should also be intertwined with your intentions for your story's plot, theme, and character arc. Now, if you're like me, early ideas for your fantasy may give you a sense of what its world looks or feels like. Perhaps in the genre's oldest tradition, it seems to take place in a pseudo-medieval setting. However, you might just as easily base your setting on modern-day social structures and mores. Either way, this provides a basis for exploring questions that can flesh out an entire world in a way that feels compelling and convincing. You can ask how the circumstances of people's lives in this period would have influenced their views. What historical developments, either positive or negative, might have led to these circumstances. And you can also retcon this by examining what you know about your character's plights or actions, and then examining what kind of history and culture would have created such a scenario. So from there, you can advance to what is often an important decision in fantasy, and that is government. Not all stories will focus on government-level conflict, but because of the scope of their stakes and their frequent thematic discussions of power, many fantasies create elaborate governments, usually based on something more than a little bit familiar. For example, in many ways, Game of Thrones is as much alternate history as fantasy, since it utilizes relatively little magic while exploring the history, culture, and themes of medieval succession, explicitly based on England's War of the Roses. Tip number 5, crafting language. Although not all fantasy stories will feature multiple and/or foreign languages, many do. Again, this is largely due to the scope of the stakes in many fantasy stories, which deal with the fates of one or more countries at the national level. Another attractive reason for indulging in special languages for your fantasy is that doing so can foster the impression your story world is as vast and varied as our own. However, a little language goes a long way in fantasy. Tolkien's linguistic genius aside, most audiences, especially readers, don't find much joy in skimming over long sentences, or, God forbid, paragraphs, they can't understand. As with every intentional decision in your story, your inclusion of made-up words should always further the story in some obvious way. One of the most obvious reasons for including a foreign word is when it makes no sense for one group of people within your world to understand the language of another. However, unless you're a linguist yourself, there's no reason not to keep your language creation relatively simple. One of the easiest approaches is to choose an existing language, one that fits the motif of your story world, and use its conventions to construct a language that follows similar rules. For example, the story I'm currently working on is set in Dark Ages Great Britain, where it makes sense to create a language that looks a little bit like Gaelic. For a heavy-duty resource, check out The Art of Language Invention by David J. Peterson, who developed the languages for the Game of Thrones HBO adaptation. And for a slightly more intuitive tool, which you can customize to the complexity you desire, check out the website vulgarlang.com. And tip number 6, weaving backstory. When you focus on backstory, you narrow your focus from the general history of your fantasy world to the specific history that informs your story and your characters. Discovering characters' backstories can be one of the most important tools for developing your fantasy world. Why? Because it tells you A, what you need your story's world to do in order to best further the story, and B, what events in your story's world's historical development are truly important. In working through your story's backstory and then plotting it, you will discover the richest and most pertinent details. And this is also an important part of the bob and weave. As you're developing your characters and plot, you will inevitably get stuck as you realize you don't know how or why to get your characters to do something important. Perhaps you don't fully understand what would motivate such a person, or perhaps you need characters to accomplish something magical, but don't know quite how your magic system will pull that off. So this is where you stop what you're doing and move over to world building. And then after a bit, you'll get stuck again. So perhaps you don't know what kind of antagonistic government might best oppose your protagonist's personal journey. Or perhaps you're worried that your magic system is starting to get too complicated. Stop again and return to ask your characters. What do they need? What best serves them? World building is one of the greatest joys of writing fantasy, but it's also one of the greatest challenges. The best fantasy stories aren't just set in immersive worlds, they're shaped by them. Every detail, from the magic system to the antagonist's philosophy, should serve the greater whole of your plot, theme, and character arcs. The key to making your fantasy world feel real isn't in how much you invent, but in how seamlessly everything fits together. By approaching your world building with purpose and flexibility, you can craft a setting that breathes with life and resonates with readers long after they turn that final page. Now, if you want your story to resonate on that deeper level, theme is the thread that ties everything together, from your antagonist's motivations to the climactic choices your protagonist faces. In my book, Writing Your Story's Theme, I break down how to craft a theme that emerges naturally from your story's elements rather than feeling forced or preachy. So if today's discussion got you thinking about the deeper layers of your plot, you'll find insight inside the book. Writing Your Story's Theme is available in paperback, ebook, and audiobook on online retailers and through the store on my site at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. And I hope you'll stop by anyway just to tell me your opinions and join the conversation on this topic. What are your favorite techniques for how to make your setting in your story feel real? And that brings us to the end of this episode of Helping Writers Become Authors. I hope you'll stop by the site for a full transcript of this episode and to join in the conversation in the comments. Tune in for next week's episode, where we'll continue to explore all things writing and storytelling. If you'd like to support the podcast, it always means a ton when you take a moment to leave a quick rating or review on Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, or Spotify. To stay updated on all the latest content I create for you, the best way is to join my mailing list at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com/mailing list. You'll also immediately gain access to lots of free resources, including my books, Crafting Unforgettable Characters and 5 Secrets of Story Structure. For real-time connection with me, more writing advice, and behind-the-scenes glimpses, follow me on Instagram at authorkmwyland. A heartfelt thank you to each one of you for your support and enthusiasm, and especially those of you who support my work on patreon.com/kmwyland. You help make my site, this podcast, and so many other resources available to writers everywhere. So until next week, keep writing, keep dreaming, and most importantly, keep being true to your stories. Thank you for being part of Helping Writers Become Authors.